This is the home of Freeport Historical Society and the sponsor of today's wonderful presentation. Before I introduce our speaker, I invite you to join me in thanking our 2010 sponsors who helped make today's presentation a reality. They are L.L. Bean, the Harris Egan Inn, Taggart Construction, Bath Savings Institution, the Hilton Garden Inn, Chilton Furniture, Buck's Naked Barbecue, Brown Goldsmiths, and Maine Optometry. I'd like to invite you to join us for beverages and sweets after Michelle's presentation today, and that'll be in the original kitchen in the house, which is just through the gate with the doorway here. And I want to let you know before we begin that we have a fundraiser coming up called Spring Serenade. It'll be March 20th. It'll feature Grammy Award-winning pianist and composer Paul Sullivan. So it'll be an intimate concert by a Grammy Award winner. It'll also include a really fantastic silent auction. If you're interested in more information about that, we'll have that out at the table where the beverages and sweets are. Today's presenter, Michelle A. Morgan, is a PhD candidate at Yale University in American Studies with a primary field of visual and material culture and a secondary field of cultural studies. First of all, Leah, let's hear it from Michelle. Yeah! She received her MA at the University of Southern Maine in 2009 with a specialization in American visual and popular culture, and graduated with a 4.0 cum. That was in the American and New England Studies program, of course. In addition to her significant academic accomplishments, Ms. Morgan has a number of publications to her credit and was nominated for a Pushcart Prize for Poetry in 2007. Michelle was born and raised in Maine. Ms. Morgan's topic today is Your Face is Like a Book, Reading the Images on Historic Postcards and Valentines. I am very pleased to introduce Michelle A. Morgan.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming out. And I was telling Christina when I got here this afternoon that this is really nice for me since I speak at conferences, but I never get to speak at home. So this is kind of my home audience, and I really appreciate everybody coming out, and I appreciate Christina putting this together, and Ned, for the collections manager, for sending me some of the images that you'll see in the exhibit here that I've tried to incorporate into my talk today. I also want to just put out a small disclaimer that there is a section of my presentation where I talked about some of the stereotypes that showed up on 19th century Valentines and on early 20th century postcards, and some of the images are relatively objectionable, and I was a little concerned that there might be kids here today, but I think all of us here at least pretend that we're adults. And so, just as a disclaimer, know that those are coming, and I'll let you know if you would rather not see those. Nothing too bad, it's just I need to disclaim beforehand. Anyhow, thank you. You can go ahead. This is my brother. He's agreed to be the support person there today. The American postcard poured into the stream of written and visual media at the Vindicapal's height, causing nothing short of an absolute frenzy in its wake. High-minded responses to the flood tended to treat postcards as a scourge, comparing them to infesting modern microbes. Many critics saw postcards and the people who used them as a disease, as children's book author John Harrington Walker wrote in the American Magazine in 1906, quote, "Postal carditis and allied collecting manias are working havoc among the inhabitants of the United States. The germs of these maladies, brought to this country in the baggage of tourists and immigrants, escaped quarantine regulations and were propagated with amazing rapidity. Unless such manifestations are checked, millions of persons of now normal lives and irreproachable habits will become victims of fatty degeneration of the brain." End quote. Harrington was not alone in condemning the postcard. His contemporary, the essayist George Fitch, was certain that using postcards would erode proper American taste and values. Fitch linked the postcard's popularity and its limited writing space to the larger demise in the United States culture of artful letter writing, stating in 1910, quote, If the souvenir card had stopped at being a purveyor of canned descriptive, it would be almost an unmixed blessing. But enterprise knows no deadline, and enterprise in the guise of a souvenir card has become a menace to the letter-writing ability of an entire nation, end quote. Critics of the souvenir card spent a good deal of energy blaming immigrants and the foreign-born for bringing postcards into popularity and into the country, as most early postcards were manufactured in Germany, and for diluting the intelligence of a supposedly superiorly literate national body. Moral indignation and outrage characterized much of this commentary. Tellingly, the height of the postcard craze corresponded exactly with the height of the influx of immigrants to the United States, initiating much talk and action about managing cleanliness, hygiene, and filth. Fear of contamination, then, was evoked against new immigrants and mass media forms like the postcard. But the relationship between the postcard and the turn-of-the-century culture is hardly as simple as these commentators suggest. The postcard as we now think of it, an image-bearing, self-contained card that can be addressed and sent through the mail without an envelope, was already in circulation in much of Europe by the time the United States approved the use of privately printed postcards here in 1898. An early precursor, the advertising trade card, which is on the left here, was used throughout the 19th century in much the same way as the advertising circulars that appear in our mailboxes today, but trade cards were limited to commercial usage. Later, companies would adapt trade cards into postcard form, as the figure on the right shows. This would have been an image that originally would have been a trade card, and then they would post them on postcards once the postcards became legalized. In 1893, the first postcards were sold at the World's Columbian Exhibition in Chicago, yet these postcards differed significantly from the postcards that followed, since they were primarily functioned as souvenir. It took another 5 years after the World's Fair in Chicago before postcards bearing no discernible souvenir value and no relation to advertising were made legal for circulation in the United States. This shift to privately printed postcards rather than publicly issued souvenir and advertisement cards sparked a nationwide movement of postcard sending, producing, and collecting. Postcards were so popular during the first decade of the 20th century that most middle-class homes were considered unfashionable if they did not display a scrapbook or album of cards collected and received. An illustration from Harrington's essay attests to exactly this. And I'd like to point out there's also a postcard album that is in the exhibition case back on the wall there. And many postcard manufacturers exploited the craze by sponsoring contests and prizes for the best collections, focusing on their own brand or specific themes. However, the craze was not simply a middle-class phenomenon. Historians have shown that everyone from England's Queen Victoria to servants also collected and sent postcards. Postcarding, as it was called, was so ubiquitous that during the peak of its popularity in 1907 to 1908, the official number of postcards sent through the U.S. mail system was recorded as 667,777,798 cards. Nearly 7 cards for every person in the country. This figure, of course, does not take into account the number of cards that were bought or sold but never actually mailed. This number is arguably as high as those that were sent through the mail, as we can tell by the number of cards still in existence that do not bear postal cancellation marks. Overwhelmed with all this new mail, a postal service worker in New York City even went on record in September 1907, telling a New York Times reporter in typical hyperbolic fashion, quote, "Young man, do you know how many individual postcards, counting both foreign and domestic, are handled in this post office every week? 350,000, sir. And that figure does not include the postals that are in the packages of mail made up abroad for direct transit to Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis, San Francisco, and other large cities. Neither does that 350,000 include the postals that are mailed in New York City for city delivery. It is a conservative estimate to say that 100,000 postcards are delivered in this city every day of the week," end quote. Excuse me. Such comments as this make it clear that the official number of postcards circulating throughout the United States in 1907 is probably conservative, even when we take into consideration the likelihood that this postal worker exaggerated things a bit. Nonetheless, the numbers are staggering even in light of earlier postcard sending trends. In 1873, the first year the government